things go. So if we go back to the First Punic War here, we talked about how the Romans were basically contesting with the Carthaginians for control of Sicily. And the Romans get pulled in by a sort of sketchy mercenary contact in Messana, where a bunch of the Mamertines, these people who are mercenaries hired by the people of Messana to help them fight Syracuse, well, they end up taking over the city instead. And this is a pretty sketchy thing, but the Romans get pulled in to help against their sort of better judgment, because they had just actually executed a bunch of people who did the same thing in Rhegium, betraying their own allies. The Romans felt the need to maintain faith with their allies, and so they made a pretty nasty punishment of these dudes, brought them all back to Rome and publicly executed them. But they come and help the people in Messana, the Mamertines, because, well, they're afraid the Carthaginians are going to get Sicily. And then if the Carthaginians control all this area around here, well, that's going to be pretty scary for Rome, because you kind of have to assume in international politics a lot of the time that the other countries are a threat. You can't just sort of go, oh, yeah, well, we've always gotten along before, or, well, they're not going to do this. You kind of like fighting for your survival, right? You have to assume that people are going to be a threat, unless there's a really good reason not to. I'm sort of dancing around this theory called political realism, or IR, international relations realism, that basically assumes that everybody is kind of like the kid on the playground who acts to act tough to avoid being beaten up. So it's not how the world should be, but it is often a good description of how the world actually is. The Romans can't know if the Carthaginians are going to invade or not, so they have to be safe and assume that they're potentially hostile. The Carthaginians have to see the Romans in the same way, and so they each are trying to control places between them to sort of make a buffer zone, but that sort of inevitably draws you into a fight. And so by trying to protect yourself, you kind of end up being pulled in instead, where, well, I need this area to keep me safe, right? Because you don't want them to get into Italy. But then, well, once you got this, you need to protect your buffer zone, so you need a buffer for your buffer, and things just sort of draw you on. So the Romans end up fighting with the Carthaginians over Sicily, and our buddy Marcus Atilius Regulus, he actually invaded into Africa, remember, after the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, where they have a massive naval victory. So we saw a little bit of this. We talked about how you have this massive army, and the Romans are using that corvus, the little boarding ramp, and how that helps them beat the superior maneuvering of the Carthaginian fleets. I linked to a video where someone talked through the sort of stages of this battle. There's no need for us to focus on that right now, but it's kind of interesting if you want to go back and take a look at this. And this is how Marcus gets to Africa, where he does pretty well for a while. But eventually, the Carthaginians end up with a Spartan, actually, a sort of random Spartan mercenary, a dude named Xanthippus, who helps them sort of get their act together and actually defeats Regulus. He gets captured and he gets tortured, apparently. And I think I overstated this a little bit, because looking back at the references for this, some of the things that I heard are actually not quite as reliable as you tend to think. So the Romans have this tradition that Regulus, well, he was sent back to Rome to convince them to make peace with the Carthaginians, and instead he's like, well, you need to honorably send me back, because I'm still their prisoner. I can't betray my oath to them that I'm going to go ask you to do this thing, but, you know, don't do it. And so he gets sent back. Here's a painting of everyone sort of begging him, please stay, don't go back to certain death. But he's like, I must do the moral thing, because of course he's a Roman, and the Romans are going to at least tell stories about themselves being moral, even if they weren't entirely. Then he goes back and he suffers this death that he knows is coming. That's kind of the story, and the story sort of tells you that it's pretty vicious. And I actually said something about eyelids that I could not find. There is no source that I can actually confirm where the eyelids came from. My teacher actually told me that, and I think I just accepted it. It's a sort of idea that or a sort of trend that a lot of these stories, particularly when they get extreme, tend to get more and more extreme, kind of like how every horror movie has to get, a little bit more gory to shock people year after year. Well, same thing happens with some of these stories, and they get embellished, embroidered upon. And so it's probably a bit of an exaggeration. The actual stuff you get in the ancient sources, well, the oldest and most reliable ones, Polybius, doesn't mention any torture at all. Seems like he just died, because he is an old dude after all. And Diodorus Siculus doesn't mention torture, but does mention that his wife, being upset about his being captured, had some Carthaginian prisoners of her own, and she might have tortured them to death in a horrible way. And so a lot of people tend to suspect that this whole story about him being tortured is kind of trying to make up for the fact that his wife maybe did this bad thing. Well, if she tortured people, well, he was tortured too. It's not like we did anything worse than those Carthaginians, because, you always want to maintain the moral high ground, right? So if someone on your own side, particularly someone important, does something bad, well, you're going to try to find an excuse for it. The story does pop up in antiquity. There's a fragment of this mostly lost historian, Tuditanus, that sort of mentions it. And Horace, in his odes, also talks a little bit about Regulus being tortured, but we don't have any good historical source. The actual sources that tell us more about Regulus being tortured in detail are later Christian things. So you get one from a text that's sort of like encouraging people to not be afraid to be martyrs. And then you get one on a similar grounds from St. Augustine's City of God, where he describes in detail the tortures of Regulus. And he's sort of like a proto-Christian idea of how to bear up under adversity, how to be strong and endure horrible things. And in that one, he is basically put in a barrel full of spikes where he can't lean anywhere, he can't fall asleep, or he just hits the spikes. And he eventually sort of like both starves and bleeds to death in this barrel where he can't move. And he was very brave, and that should inspire us all. But, St. Augustine, not exactly someone that you want to go to for issues of fact. If you are more interested in how to, feel really bad about maybe having stolen some pears at one point while not being concerned at all that, you've treated your mother like garbage for your entire life, and you may have, condemned one of your followers to an eternity of hell, well, then St. Augustine's got you covered. But for this, probably not so much. So the whole idea of Regulus being tortured is kind of exaggerated, but he does die in captivity held by the Carthaginians. So Carthage ends up being saved by this mercenary Xanthippus, and the invasion of Africa comes to nothing. But the war is still going on in Sicily, and a lot of things happen. The Romans actually lose 2 fleets to storms. One of the fleets evacuating most of the people that survived and escaped from Regulus's defeat there. That fleet gets busted up by a storm. Lots of people lost. And similarly, an entire fleet is lost in 254. So the Romans lose 2 fleets with, tens of thousands of casualties. Remember that every ship has hundreds of people on the oars, and a lot of them are carrying soldiers. Well, these are massive losses. Then the Romans actually lose in a battle too, at the Battle of Drepana, where Publius Claudius Pulcher, Publius Claudius the pretty or the good looking here, that's his family name, not just him. A whole family of good-looking people. He is defeated in a battle, and this is the one where you hear about the sacred chickens, where allegedly, and this is another story that might be exaggerated, but it's fun to say, he has the Polarius pull out the sacred chickens to see if the gods are on their side. You always want the chickens to greedily eat. For that reason, you often don't give them food, so that then they eat a bunch of food immediately, and it's actually better if they don't just eat, but they eat so fast that a little bit of it falls out of their mouths. That is a particularly good omen. Well, these chickens don't eat at all. Maybe they're seasick. And he says, well, if they won't eat, let them drink, and throws the sacred chickens into the sea. Obviously, this is the reason he loses the battle. Also, his sister, one of the many women just named Claudia, is being carried around in her litter one day in the city of Rome, and it is quite congested. Traffic isn't so good, and it was a major scandal that people overheard her saying, I wish my brother were around to lose another fleet, because you run out of people then, and there would be fewer people in the streets. So the Claudii, this family that ends up being, kind of the ancestors of our friends, the Julio-Claudian emperors, they have a reputation for being quite arrogant, and you see it early on here. So the Romans have a lot of reverses, but they're still doing well on land. And for a while, they're not willing to contest the sea anymore because they've lost a lot of. They take a few years break from having a navy here after 254. And then when they rebuild their navy in 249, well, it goes pretty badly there too. But eventually, they realize there's nothing else they can do, and they have to besiege the city of Lilybaeum. And I want to just go back to this map, if I can get it to pull up here, to show you where Lilybaeum is. This is a really key point. This is like the Romans have like taken most of the land of Sicily, but this is the big city on the western side of Sicily. It's a Carthaginian stronghold, and they just can't besiege it. They can't starve it into submission. And a bunch of Carthaginians are actually sailing in with like supplies, relief forces, and things like that constantly. The Romans try to do a blockade, but there's actually one fellow, and I wish Ryan were here for this because he would appreciate it, one fellow named Hannibal, but not that Hannibal. Hannibal called the Rhodian, not like the green dudes from Star Wars, but Rhodian with RH, like the island of Rhodes. He got a nickname that because the Rhodians were good sailors, and he was a good sailor too. And for a long time, he, with his little ship, manages to slip in and bring key supplies to Lilybaeum, keeping it going in the war. But eventually, Gaius Lutatius Catulus, Gaius Lutatius the puppy, that's what that means. Imagine your general has the last name of Puppy. He besieges them. Well, I don't know why it says besieges Drepana. He besieges Lilybaeum, and he defeats the giant relief force that finally comes there in 241, actually with some clever naval tactics, because he realizes that the weather is really bad, and so most people are telling him not to go for a sea battle, but he recognizes that his ships are relatively light, and it seems like at this point they're probably not using the Corvus anymore, but they are just normal old naval battle tactics that are being used. But the Carthaginian ships, because they're carrying a lot of troops and a lot of food for the city, are going to be a lot more slow in maneuvering. So even though there are really bad weather conditions, he realizes that his ships are going to do better in them than the Carthaginians by a lot. And so he takes that momentary opportunity to have basically a crushing defeat of the Carthaginian fleet. And at that point, this war has been going on for over 20 years. And this war would be old enough to vote. And drink in America. And so they're just exhausted. They can't do anymore. And that's pretty much the end of the war. And the Carthaginians have to negotiate surrender. So the Romans have effectively taken Sicily. Now, the general who was holding out here in Sicily, who was doing a really good job, is a dude named Hamilcar. Hold on to that name, it'll be important in a minute. He is not very happy about all this. So the Carthaginians, they have to pay a massive indemnity to the Romans. They have to pay a ton of silver. And the Romans really extort the heck out of the Carthaginians, where they actually claim, oh, some of the silver you sent us, it's not actually full quality. We need some more. So like they just add insult to injury here. And then, well, the Carthaginians, they're sort of bringing their army back to Carthage, and they're trying to demobilize them. But they have a further problem because the Romans have largely citizen and allied armies, but the Carthaginians have a mercenary force. Now, if you've just had to pay a ton of money to the people that beat you in a war, you have a little bit of a problem trying to pay those mercenaries. And the Carthaginians make a critical mistake. While they bring them back slowly, they're still not able to pay them. And so these mercenaries build up around the city of Carthage. And eventually, they realize they're not going to get their money. And they are not happy. And the Carthaginians spend the next couple years dealing with a very bloody war where their own mercenary army turns against them and marauds around the countryside here in Libya, just laying waste to everything and committing some really unspeakable atrocities. It's one of the most vicious conflicts the Carthaginians end up dealing with, and it almost brings them down. Eventually, combination of Hanno and Hamilcar are able to put an end to it, but it is brutal. And the Romans see this opportunity to, well, extort a little more. While the Carthaginians are having difficulties here, the Romans basically threaten them. They find a fake excuse to basically demand that the Carthaginians hand over Corsica and Sardinia. And the Carthaginians are so occupied with this mercenary war that they can't do anything. And so the Romans really treacherously, against the terms of their agreement, seize Corsica and Sardinia. So this is pretty sketchy. And this means that the Carthaginians haven't just lost a bitter, long war, but they are really upset. And this lays the stage, or this lays the ground for resentment that is going to last and trigger the Second Punic War in, a couple decades' time here. Because you go from 241, the end of the First Punic War, to 218, the beginning of the Second. The Carthaginians have lost this whole area here. These are all pretty wealthy places that would earn them a lot of money, and they are kind of a trade empire. Remember, they're not as much in the way of territorial occupation. So Hamilcar, the guy who was in charge of the final ground operations in Sicily and was doing a pretty good job, he feels a bit betrayed by the Carthaginians in general. He feels like he didn't get the support he needed, and if he only could have gotten some reinforcements, he could have held out. He could have won the war, he thinks. And so he goes off to Spain, where the Carthaginians have some established settlements, but not a lot. And he starts bringing this whole area under his control. So Hamilcar, he is from a family called the Barcids. So Hamilcar Barca. And the Barcids are one of the big sort of dynastic families in Carthage. And a lot of the people in Carthage are kind of worried because, well, he's off here on his own, and he ends up having his sons basically succeed him. First Hasdrubal, and then the famous Hannibal. And basically, this isn't under direct control of the Senate of Carthage, but it's almost functioning like its own little kingdom. It's allied to the Carthaginians, but one family is running it all. That really doesn't square with the sort of government you have in Carthage, and they're kind of uncomfortable about this. And eventually, this is going to lead them into war with Rome. They're worried that they're going to actually mount a coup and use their wealth in Spain to come take back over Carthage. Instead, Hannibal is going to stir up a war with Rome that the people in Carthage are not going to be entirely down with, initially at least. But in your readings, you saw a little bit about this story of the oath of Hannibal. And this is something that gets a lot of play and is pretty famous. It gets a lot of paintings. Here is one where you can see a little Hannibal here swearing as he's sacrificing a cow. So swearing before, the Romans will say Jupiter, but for them it probably would have been Baal. He's swearing to Baal, B-A-A-L, that he's going to always be an enemy of the Romans. And you hear this story so much that you might think it's true. Maybe. It's probably the case that at least Hannibal said this, but we don't really know how much faith to put in it, because this is one of those stories that is almost a little too good to be true. The Romans' greatest enemy ends up having been made to swear as a child to always be their enemy. It's just a little bit too much like something out of a movie. And so the actual sources for this are interesting. Livy tells it like it just happened. And he is drawing on Polybius, my favorite Greek historian here, who is much closer to these events. And Polybius tells this story, but he tells it in a slightly interesting context, where after Hannibal has already lost in the Second Punic War, he isn't able to stay in Carthage anymore, and he flees to people who he thinks are going to be Rome's enemies. And he ends up at the court of Antiochus III, who is the king of the Seleucid Empire, which is Rome's last major sort of rival in the Mediterranean world. And Antiochus is considering war with Rome. And the Romans actually they send some people there and they try to discredit Hannibal. They are looking for an opportunity to do away with him. They'll succeed eventually. But they basically try to act so friendly to Hannibal that Antiochus is going to be suspicious. And so Hannibal then ends up having to prove it, it's not enough that he fought this like 20-year war against the Romans. He has to really defend himself to Antiochus. It's a little bit unreasonable. But in the course of this conversation, Hannibal defended himself on various grounds, and at length, being at a loss for further arguments, resorted to the following. He said that at the time when his father was about to start with his army on his expedition to Spain, he himself, then 9 years of age, was standing by the altar, while Hamilcar was sacrificing to Zeus, by which we mean Baal. When, on the omens being favorable, Hamilcar had poured a libation to the gods and performed all the customary rites, he ordered the others who were attending the sacrifice to withdraw to a slight distance, and calling Hannibal to him, asked him kindly if he wished to accompany him on the expedition. On his accepting with delight and, like a boy, even begging to do it besides, his father took him by the hand and led him up to the altar, and bade him lay his hand on the victim and swear never to be a friend to the Romans. He begged Antiochus then, now that he knew this for a fact, as long as his intentions were hostile to Rome, to rely on him confidently and believe that he would have in him his sincerest supporter. So, it seems like Hannibal probably told this story, but, he's telling it for a very specific purpose. He's trying to convince this dude, Antiochus, to trust him to let him in on fighting this new war with the Romans. So you don't know how far you want to believe this. Hannibal probably said something like this, but it's not clear how reliable it is because he has his own reasons for it. But it's a cool story, and people, make a lot of it. Here's one where where little Hannibal looks like a little British lord, and he's just quite happy about. Oh, come on, he's quite happy about that. And then there's, of course, the comic history of Rome, which is, of course, supposed to be funny for little British school children, and I'm not sure quite where the humor lays in this, except that he's got like a little drum and like a little hobby horse that you would ride around. I don't know. Is that a fish? I'm not really sure. But it's funny, right? So there is Hannibal. So Hannibal is going to become Rome's biggest enemy, of course. And the way he starts this war is he doesn't just end up with a war with the Romans. He resents this whole thing. Hamilcar resents the Romans. He's just looking for a reason. And he's operating in Spain, sort of bringing all these tribes in here. Some of them kind of Celtic. Some of them are described as Celtiberians, which is kind of a strange term that it's not clear that the Romans really knew what they were saying when they used that. But you have all these sort of very, very powerful warlike tribes in this area here. And you have a few major Carthaginian settlements. You have Gades, which is going to be an important town. This is the later city Cadiz. And you get Carthago Nova, New Carthage, Cartagena, which is sort of like the main sort of Carthaginian place here. And this other city is going to be really important. You have Saguntum. And Saguntum, for reasons that are not entirely clear, is a Roman ally. Why the Romans have a connection with Saguntum is difficult to say. There's also this issue with this treaty, the Treaty of the Ebro River, here the Ibera, where the Romans had an agreement with the Carthaginians that the Carthaginians weren't supposed to cross the Ebro River in force. Well, some Romans will then say, well, you've attacked Saguntum, but wait, Saguntum is on this side of the Ebro. The treaty issue is its own deal. It's clear that some of the sources get confused, and I don't want to get into this too much, but for whatever reason, the Romans end up allied with this town of Saguntum, and Hannibal starts besieging it. The Romans, initially, they think they have all the time in the world. They send some delegates to Saguntum to say, Hannibal, cut it out. Saguntum is our ally. And Hannibal just doesn't really care. He says, you have an issue with this? Go to Carthage. And so they do. The people in Carthage are not very happy with this. They don't really like that Hannibal is sort of pulling them into another war with Rome so soon, even if they don't like the Romans. They're a little bit worried about this. But kind of like on the playground, right? You don't want to back down. You don't want to show weakness. You can't really, they're afraid that if they act weak, the Romans are going to bully them even more. And so they end up having to be aggressive back to the Romans. And so when one of the Romans, he makes this big speech, and this is supposed to sound impressive. It ends up sounding rather ridiculous. He says, he puts his hand in his toga, covered up, and he says, I bear in my toga peace and war. Choose Carthage, which you would like. I think it just sounds kind of goofy. But anyway, the Carthaginians are forced to say, well, we're going to have to choose war if the demand is like that you have us arrest one of our most important citizens and hand him over to you as a war criminal. Well, we can't really do that. You know, they can't back down there either. If they do that, then who knows what the Romans are going to ask next. So the Romans and the Carthaginians end up at war. And the Romans are pursuing this. They think that they're going to be able to force, Hannibal to back down. But while they've been pursuing all this diplomacy, Hannibal, being an extremely competent general, has already defeated Saguntum. So the Romans actually fail their ally. They spend this time sending to Saguntum and then sending people to Carthage and thinking they have all the time in the world while the siege is going on. And meanwhile, Hannibal has like wiped this city off the face of the earth and has already crossed with his army, preparing to cross the Alps into Italy. And the Romans are really taken by surprise. And so that's where we're going to leave it for now. Hannibal has a bunch of war elephants, and he is going to try to cross the Alps into Italy. So that is how that war starts. And let me just stop this now.